And our guest is Federico Sohns, creator of Nibiru RPG, yeah?
Mm-hmm. Yes, indeed.
All right. So first of all, we got a question to you: how your history with the RPG starts? Sorry, tabletop RPGs.
Okay. It kind of starts when I was more or less like 15. I got together with a friend at his house, basically to play Warhammer Fantasy First Edition. I'm 28 now, so yeah, that's more or less like 13 years ago. And we basically just like took the rule set and were like, this is very long. It sounds boring. We don't want to read this. And we basically just like tweaked it around and started toying around with it. So we kind of like started deciding stuff like from the get-go, right? But yeah, that was basically my first story, my first game, essentially, Warhammer First Edition. And then on to that, I kind of stopped role-playing for like a while, and I got back to it when I was about 19, and I got invited to a World of Darkness, New World of Darkness session, and from then on, I kind of didn't stop, basically.
Well, this is very interesting because this is a very, very common. It was common in the Polish World of RPG when we started. People start from the Warhammer and go to the World of Darkness, and they were changing. For example, what the same with me. So I exactly remember those times.
I think that only in Europe the Warhammer sells good, actually.
Yeah, most in Poland. What I heard. Yeah, this is our first foreign system on our market. So a lot of people start from the Warhammer. All right. So getting further. If you're talking about the systems, you talk about already about the Warhammer, about the World of Darkness. What about your favorite system right now, on today?
My favorite system right now is Dialect. I don't know if you know it.
Sadly not.
It's basically a game in which you and the group take roles within a small community, and you develop a language as like different eras pass. So with each era that's passing, there's a scene or an event where a new terminology or new words come in to make this language, and eventually the community and the language kind of like dies off, but it sort of like tells a story of a community through language. It's very interesting. It's really, really nice mechanically, I think. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So maybe now we're gonna ask you about the name.
Yeah, the specific name Nibiru. Why did you choose Nibiru for a name for your system?
Why did I choose that name? Good question. Basically, I chose it because essentially I wanted to sort of like imagine what would happen if this space station that I was writing about had a small or like a tiny appearance, let's say, in human history. So, and Nibiru technically is sort of like the name of a celestial body mentioned in so like ancient Mesopotamian records, but maybe like the idea that thing was actually like that there's something sort of like mysterious in that, and kind of making that connection was kind of what I wanted to go for. Basically that.
Okay. All right.
So maybe let's talk about your inspirations of building this RPG.
Okay. Inspiration-wise, I think generally, like I draw much more inspiration from nonfiction than fiction itself. I think like just reading history, anthropology, etc. At least to me, is much more inspiring. Like there are some sort of like works of fiction that I'd say have similarities with Nibiru. I mentioned specifically Blame in the book. That has like a very it's probably like the most similarly in terms of like the aesthetic of some huge superstructure, and people sort of like lost wandering around the superstructure and not knowing how it works. It's very like kind of like Blame, but in terms of like actual inspiration, like stuff that I draw upon, it's mostly history, anthropology, and generally I'd say in Nibiru's case, because like it kind of like started off as a mechanic more than as a setting. It was basically just me wanting to write about memory and the idea that, well, how memory and what we learn basically influences us in different ways, and that was sort of like the starting point. But yeah, I generally take more influence from real life or like nonfiction. I think it's kind of one of those things that, like, if you ask like a graphic artist or someone that paints, they'll generally tell you that, like, to draw, they will take references from like real life pictures and stuff like that. It's quite different from sort of like taking all of your references from other pieces of fiction, wherein you're kind of like adding baggage and stuff that other creators put in that you might not be aware of generally. But yeah, that's basically what's it.
You mentioned about memory. For me, that's quite interesting character development process. Why did you choose memory? Like when we heard about the language system, the dialect, was it some kind of inspiration for you? Because there are not so many RPGs basing around language or memory systems, actually.
Yeah, there aren't many. However, it's for example, in like if you watch anime or read Japanese manga, like the amnesiac story is like super widely used, and then I think there is a subset of role players that is quite big, that generally have bring something to the table that still unresolved. This idea that, for example, like you probably like run a game, or you've probably been like one of those players yourselves, where you think about this character, you get engrossed in the character, and you start writing the background, but then making that transition wherein you wrote the background and the GM uses the background is very hard, because it basically means you're going to give the GM this thing that he has to read, or they have to read and implement it somehow and make it work with everything. And that's a problem, a mechanical problem that not many systems have really tackled. And that's basically what I'm trying to do with Nibiru, is to sort of like slowly drip feed this stream of like background sort of like snippets and affect the character essentially, and to sort of like take that responsibility away from the GM and make it work. And it like a lot of like really interesting side effects come from that too. So yeah.
All right, so those things about the word, we only ask you because the whole Nibiru, the whole word that's shown in the game, it's a bit mystery for everyone. And how exactly the world building process look for you in that case? How you create the habitats, everything. It looks. Of course, there are still so many places that are probably not shown in the book, yeah? So how exactly you work on it?
Well, it's kind of like world building wise, just kind of like what I'm most passionate about in a creative project is always driven by themes. And in Nibiru, there's sort of like two major theme axes, as I'd like to call it, which are memory and identity, and nature and artificiality. And nature and artificiality particularly are pretty much well represented in the world. Like the idea is that I wanted to create a world in which the concept that we have from Earth of nature is sort of like warped, it's sort of like flipped on its head, and what's artificial is also like kind of strange. Because the thing with Nibiru is that like everything surrounding us is like made of metal, everything is powered by the electricity, the very creatures that roam the world and the fungi and the sort of like fauna and flora that inhabit the world are all powered by electricity, and humanity is the only sort of like lone entity that cannot do that it cannot feed on electricity, that like actually is hurt by electricity. So that sort of like creates, I think, a mythology and a sort of like cosmovision for humanity that is very different from what we have on Earth. And I really wanted to like explore that and explore how religion develops from that, how societies develop from that, and sort of like Nibiru became this perfect vehicle for exploring those two themes in conjunction. Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I thought about when I look at the bestiary of Nibiru. Bestiary. Mm-hmm. It's mostly like hard SF, actually, the old hard SF autos. They use the normal. That's really cool. But I wanted to talk about the climate. For me, when I look at the book, it was more of a weird or horror rather than science fiction. Did you intend it that way?
It's kind of an interesting question, because it is not intended to be a horror game, but it is, I think, evident that when people are confronted by that sort of world, they would feel unease. Like, you know, it's an unnatural feel. It's kind of like an uncanny sort of thing. I think the fact that this sort of like warped vision of nature and like an artificiality are sort of like there, and people are sort of like living their lives like that. I think that because the world is very dark and and everything is like changed in this way that like has a logic, but at the same time is not like Earth, where the feeling of horror comes in. Because if you actually look at the book, there's maybe one or two examples of things that are kind of like horror thing, but aside from that, like it's not that stuff is designed specifically to scare you or to make it horrifying. Like even some of the most terrifying things maybe you can find in the book, which are like the asapu, that's like this horrifying thing like attached to your head. It basically said it's you know, it's a symbiote sort of like life form, and it kind of helps you live in the dark. And there's stuff in our world which is like super scary. But at the same time, of course, we don't say, I don't know, maybe you believe that God created it to make us like feel horror about it. It just is. And a lot of the stuff in the bestiary, for example, is totally like inspired by real stuff, biology. The mermaids, which like people have talked about, like the mermaids in Nibiru, that sort of like creature that sort of like takes over your body and basically manages with your like electrical impulses. It exists. It's an actual bug that takes over like bugs that come to like feed in or lay eggs in like a pool of water or something. Like it's from real life. There's nothing original.
Yeah, also when talking about the bestiary, the arts look really awesome. And we're gonna ask you especially about this. How is with the graphic? How exactly do you have most of the influence on it, or maybe someone else? How exactly the creation looks like?
So of course there's like a lot of illustrators involved in it. I merely just do the art direction of it. I think I have one or two pieces, but they're very minor. Like the whole process, I think, with art was just focusing on like delineating one or two themes that I wanted across the book, which were basically blue and orange as themes, and high contrast within those colors. So you'll get like very dark pictures, sort of like transmitting that feel of like there's this dark world, is like there's no sky, etc. And also playing around with blue and the orange and the contrast between both. So most of them will feature those shades and a bit in between. That makes it very easy to work with a big cast of illustrators, because if you look at the illustrator list, there's a long list. There's a lot of people involved in it, but defining those very hard limits of what we're working with help bring everything together and make it cohesive. Because like in an indie project where you're constantly checking your budget and seeing if you can finance this or that piece of art, sometimes it's hard. Sometimes like you can't commit to like 5 pieces, so it means that you're getting an artist for like 2 or 3 pieces and then they go away. And if you're like me being like, okay, I want 70 pieces for the Nibiru core book, it gets hard. So you have to like set that up so that everything comes together and sort of works in a way.
Yeah, and I recently found out the Nibiru has been nominated for the contest for Emmys for the best cover art.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was nominated for cover art and cartography. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we will paste the link here.
Cool.
Okay, and I want to talk about the maps because when I look at the maps for the system, they are very anatomical, actually. They reminded me like the medical examination or something like that. Was it intended that?
That's a great observation. And again, in a way, it's a way of conveying the sort of like duality between artificiality and what's natural. If I give you basically something that's of course, it's like tunnels and it's like metal construct, but it looks like, I don't know, like an X-ray of like a spinal cord or something like that, and it kind of blurs the line. And it's an achievement of like the artist in this case to kind of like bring together those two themes and be like, you know, this is the map, and this is why it looks so unique in a way, because we're taking those two themes and we're kind of working with that to make something different. But yeah.
Right, so we also get a few questions maybe at the end, because
to sum things up.
Yeah, add something in a way. In your opinion, currently tabletop RPGs, as an open question, of course, get a future in the industry of the games, or even industry in the social life as an aspect? Do you think we're gonna see some big improvements, some changes, or maybe the people are going to start, turning in the other way, maybe to technology, and they forget about storytelling?
No, I think it'll never go away. If there's something like with this whole like coronavirus situation that's happened, is that like if people really want to get together, people will go out of their way to just get together and see each other face to face. I think it's just a natural need, and I think that like. I love video games. Video games are fascinating, something that I want to work with at some point. But at the same time, I think role-playing games have this very sort of like intimate and special atmosphere that they create that it's just very hard to replace. And overall, if you think about it, as a creative space, it's very new. Not much has changed in many ways from like the days when like Dungeons and Dragons was the only thing around, or Chainmail or whatever it was. And there is so much to explore, especially with like new technologies. Like we've seen now games like Alice is Missing and stuff like that uses like text messaging as part of the mechanics. So there's so much room to explore, and that's very that's like a fascinating thing about the medium, which is not the same that I could say like I don't know, with like movies maybe, or video games. You do maybe get some like new sort of like revolutionary thing, but if you see the jump from like one sort of like console generation from now to like what was happening before generations, like a while ago, like changes are slowing down. I think that TTRPGs have much more room to like improve and sort of like change the game in a way at the moment, at least. So yeah, it's a very rewarding creative space to work in, I think.
Since we are talking about the future, I would like to ask you: is for you Nibiru a closed system, or you plan some more add-ons, for example?
Yes, I'm currently working on an expansion book for Nibiru. I think the gist of that would be because the core book sort of talks more about like individual memory and individual identity. I want to take that into like a group sort of like concept, how collective memory shapes the identity of groups. So groups of people, in this case, could be like the groups of the players. Like how the group develops a mythology about themselves and how the world around them regards the group and their history, etc., and sort of like work with that in the same way that communities have their own legends and iconography and their history and their identity, how it's shaped, like countries, sects, religions, etc. I want to sort of like explore that, and that's sort of like the objective of this expansion book, at least. Mm-hmm.
That's great. Since we are meeting here on courtesy of Triglav Studios, I wanted to ask you, how do you find your work with Polish developers and translators?
Very hands-on. I think it's like the Polish edition of Nibiru is the one that has been like sort of like more that we've had like a face-to-face thing or sort of like a daily, not daily, but like very, very present relationship with. I think it's quite interesting because a lot of the other translation deals that we've been working with have been a bit more like removed. Maybe like I give you the thing, they do their thing, they come back eventually, and sort of like that. But I really appreciate the closeness, let's say, of the process for the Polish translation of Nibiru. I think that's great.
Anyway, do we know that already Triglav Studio is publishing the Polish version of Nibiru soon? Is that many of the other countries interested? Any other publisher from the other countries interested in Nibiru?
Yeah. We're currently working, that I can say we're working on a Spanish translation. There are a couple more that are in the pipeline, but I can't talk about them. But yeah, the Spanish translation is probably going to be the first one to come out. Mm-hmm.
Great. So I think that sums things up. And thank you for the interview.
No, thanks to you guys. It was great.